Hello, good morning everyone, and welcome to a Big Data London webinar at a new time of 10 a.m. So good to see you all bright and breezy. Today we're discussing data sovereignty at scale. As always, I'm Andy Steed, Content Director of Big Data London, and I'm joined today by Buddha from Tyke. Hi, Buddha.
Hi, Andy. Happy to be here.
Yes, so these sessions are designed to be interactive. Please send your questions in using the question box underneath the screen, and I'll endeavour to ask as many of them as I can to Buddha after the presentation. Just a quick note on housekeeping. If you lose the stream at any point, you shouldn't, but if you do, just hit refresh in your browser and you should jump straight back in. So without further ado, I'd like to throw it over to Buddha for the main presentation here. Over to you, Buddha.
Thanks a lot, Andy. I will start, as you do, with sharing my screen. I'm just going to bring up my slides. So, okay, let me present, and we should be good to go. Is it all good for, can you see my screen?
Okay. All good. Go ahead.
Fantastic. All right, once again, hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, evening, morning. I'm actually joining you today from Singapore. So it's pretty much now 6:30 p.m. local time over here. So it's kind of coming to the end of the day. So yeah, very, very happy to have you all on board. Today we're going to be talking about dealing with data sovereignty at scale. I'm pretty certain somewhere, somehow you might have come across this term. If you have been dealing with application development, or you have a business that talks about a little bit into APIs, a little bit with data, I think you might have come across this term. So today, we are going to try and endeavor into understanding this a little bit more, some of the nuances around it. We'll talk through a little bit of a case study around, or rather not a case study, but more like a use case in terms of how you can approach the possible challenges that come with data sovereignty when you're looking at it at scale. So with that, I am Buddha. I am a product evangelist at Tyke. So Tyke is for those who do not know, if you already know, that's fantastic. Tyke is an API management solution that we provide. And basically, we'll talk a little bit about what that means, what that entails, how that actually helps. And my own role essentially is around showcasing the capabilities of Tyke, which essentially helps with business growth, digital transformation, what we have done so far with businesses, what we are doing at the moment, and what we will be doing in the future. So that's my role. I'm like I said, I'm based out of Singapore. So coming to you across 2 regions today. So that's going to be quite interesting, which actually goes in very nicely with our data sovereignty discussion, where we look at multiple regions and how you can handle that. What we'll be covering today, like I said, we've already gone through the bit of introduction part. We'll then be looking at what data sovereignty is and why it is important, followed by some of the key considerations and challenges that come with data sovereignty. Then I've got a little bit of a use case of sort through our little ACME toy store, and we'll really go through the journey of growth when it comes to this particular business and what kind of challenges that they might be facing, what kind of considerations that they might need to do in order to build out a solution that would potentially comply with the regulations around. And then finally, of course, we'll cap it all off with a Q&A session where we can discuss and pick up your questions. So keep those questions coming for sure. You've got a panel on the right-hand side which you can use, and I'm sure Andy and I will be tackling those towards the end of the session. Moving right along. So, of course, you've heard about this. So let's address it right away. What is data sovereignty? And there might be a few other, I would say, descriptions, a few other definitions. But really, what it boils down to is adherence to local regulations for the collection, storage, and processing of data. Now, it's really about taking control of your data, looking at where it's being stored, how it's being stored, and more importantly, also looking at how things are being processed. So that at a baseline is what data sovereignty is in a single line, and we'll go over the little bit of nuances that goes with it. Next up, why is it that this is something that you should consider, or why is this important for you? So of course, it is a compliance, and therefore it's essentially looking at looking at regulations and things that are in place. So non-compliance to certain things like these, non-compliance to data sovereignty rules essentially could lead to trouble. It essentially becomes a huge hindrance to growth, which is essentially what you're trying to do when you are building out a business. You're trying to scale, you're trying to reach out to as many people as possible and providing a better user experience. And if you are stuck up with non-compliance issues and legal issues, you're fighting legal battles, then you're essentially fighting fires instead of focusing on the growth of your business, and which ultimately leads to potentially shutting down your business, which obviously no one wants. Second is loss of trust. So loss of trust is always going to be bad for business because users today are a lot more aware, a lot more informed about where and how the data is being used. They want to know about it, they're concerned about it. And therefore, once that little trust is gone, it becomes a big challenge essentially to recover that. And users today are also looking to believe in more of a product story, product journey, not just buying things just for the hell of it. I think there is a little bit around the story factor that people do go into as well. It's not true for every single one of the businesses, but it is a consideration today as the landscape exists. And then finally, I think I'm going to be emphasizing this importantly because this is what has led to the shutting down of a lot of businesses, and therefore end of business is a big challenge if you're not really complying to your data sovereignty rules. It may feel a little bit morbid in this case, but it is a reality. And then finally, loss of reputation. It goes with the loss of trust, but lost reputation again means that you have no takers, which means that once you don't have any takers, you don't have users, that impacts the financials of your business once again. And once the damage is done in this field, it is really hard to make a recovery from there. Because there is, again, the story has been etched in the minds of your users that this is how the business operates and is going to operate in the future, and it becomes it becomes quite difficult to essentially do damage control once that reputation has been lost. So finally, point number 3 goes back to goodbye business. So when is it that you should be considering this? When does this sort of come into place? And the first part is really looking at when you are scaling across regions. So of course, you've built your business, you've started off small, you've got some users going, and now you're sort of looking to scale out across different regions. And there could be a few different reasons for that, scaling across regions, one of which is for better user experience. This further goes into low latency. So better user experience, again, you can provide a little bit more of a localized experience for people, whether that is different kinds of content that needs to go in, whether that is just the speed at which things are being delivered. That's where you have your user experience, your low latency, as well as personalization. All of these things, when you're scaling across regions, you want to be as close to the users as possible in order to provide the best possible experience for the people who are going to be buying your product, who are going to be using your product. So scaling across a region would be the first case where you need to start thinking about your data sovereignty needs, because your data is likely going to be sitting across multiple regions, and therefore your compliance requirements might come in to play. Second is, again, this is something actually a little bit more common than even scaling for that matter, which is backing up of your data. So this could be part of your disaster recovery strategy, where what typically happens is you've got a business going, you've got your main applications in production, playing quite well with your users, playing with that setup. However, you need to cater for business continuity in case something goes terribly wrong. And when that goes wrong, you essentially say whether that is across a geographical location. Let's say I'm currently based out of Singapore, and if there was a situation where there is a single data center in Singapore and that has gone down, then you need to have some form of strategy, some form of disaster recovery or business continuity plan in place, which would ensure that your users are not cut off from your services. Because once again, it has a huge impact on your business. It has huge impact on your reputation, and therefore, once again, could mean the end of the road for you. So that's the two main situations, I think, where you need to start considering or start thinking about data sovereignty. The other thing which I think I have not mentioned here is also being aware. I think awareness is a big deal, and we'll talk about that towards the end. But I would just say when you are scaling across different regions or backing up your data and starting to think about data sovereignty, it is very important to also be aware of what kind of rules that you need to be following. That could be dependent on the region itself, as well as the vertical in which you are operating. And therefore, that becomes quite important. Now, there are a couple of different aspects of data sovereignty, or management of your data, that is quite important. And the first one is data at rest. This is typically the more common thing that comes up because you start thinking about your compliances and rules and regulations. And the first thing that comes up is, okay, where is my data being stored, or how is it being stored? This could be, again, depending on how your solution has been architected. This could go to whether you are looking at an on-premises based setup where you own the data center, or you have your own local data center where this is being hosted. Or it could also mean looking at cloud-hosted solutions as well and how they are handling it. Now, the tricky bit with cloud hosting, so of course, there is a bit of a convenience versus control debate that comes in where you've got your on-premises setup, where of course you get a whole lot of control in terms of how your data is sitting at rest. But at the same time, it could bring in the challenge, of course, maintenance and really looking after your own data, your own system, your own infrastructure, which could pretty much add again to your costs. It could add again to your resource requirements. Now, of course, there's a trade-off. There is no right or wrong answer with this. On the other side of the spectrum, with cloud hosting solution, again, you get a slightly lesser control, I would say, depending on what kind of regions things are being made available to. But because it's a managed solution, the level of control, of course, is a little bit lesser because while you can set your own rules in certain cases, you do have to adhere to some of the preset rules that the cloud hosting vendor essentially puts in place as well. So, of course, there is that convenience debate that comes in as well, where you can get up and running and started really quickly, and we'll see that when we start looking into our use case today. So, with that in place, the next part, when we look at data at rest, you do need to think about where and how it is being stored. A typical challenge around this is really when you're looking at cloud hosting solutions and you want to have automatic recoveries or automatic backups in place. You need to be very careful in terms of where that automatic recovery is sitting. In most cases, most of the bigger cloud hosting providers, you do get the option of selecting the region where your backups are going to be stored to. But sometimes what happens is there can be replication rules as well. Once again, an automated disaster recovery rule is put in place automatically so that if there is loss of data, the recovery happens from yet another region again. So you need to be quite aware of this. And this will allude to this again, where transparency becomes quite important here when it comes to dealing with cloud providers and cloud vendors. The second aspect of this which is a little bit less talked about and sometimes get missed out, is data in transit. So how is your data transiting on the wire? What does the data transition channel look like? Like from the point where the user is making a request to your application, then calling your microservices or backend essentially, and talking to your database or the different data sources that you have in place, and then coming back up. That entire journey is something that is quite important, quite essential to understand, because it's not only about how things are being collected, how your data is being collected or stored, but also how or where your data is being processed, which becomes very important. Again, depending on what kind of rules and regulations you need to adhere to, some obviously being a little bit more lenient over the others, I think you need to understand that this can be quite an issue. So usually two big factors when it comes to data sovereignty or scaling up or recovery. One is data storage, which is a bit more common, easier to see. The trickier one tends to be around data transit, data in transit or on the wire, because you need to be careful about how things are being processed, where things are being processed, how many hops is your data essentially making from the user all the way to the source and back. And that obviously brings up the challenge of security. You need to make sure that things like encryptions are put in place so that your data is safe, it is secure, and potentially does not compromise or breach the privacy of sensitive information that you might be dealing with. Of course, the nature of data makes a big difference there, but it is something to be really careful about and be aware of, and is quite often missed out. So with that, I will just set the scene a little bit for our little case study or use case today, where we're going to be talking a little bit about an e-commerce store called ACME Toy Store. And as the name suggests, it is essentially selling toys. Pardon me, because I've been looking at a lot of Marvel these days, a lot of Disney these days. I've got a goddaughter as well, and she's just about to turn 2. So and her birthday is coming up. So I've been looking at a whole lot of different toys around the world. She's a big fan of Disney as well. And so this sort of clicked in that fashion. So I'm going to just take this forward. So it's a simple business. We are starting, let's assume this is sort of day 1 or the week 1 of production. The architecture that I'm looking at this point of time is I've got all of these underlying services. Now it may look like it is a single service, but it's essentially a list of different microservices that are powering my application. That could be payments, that could be user information, that could be my product listing. So a whole range of different microservices powering my back end, which then feeds into my application through an API gateway. Now, an API gateway is not necessary. So an API gateway over here, you could very easily just remove it. You could have your backend services talking directly to your front-end application, whether that is a mobile application or whether that is a web-based application. You could just have that. The key reason, and when you have that, again, there's nothing wrong with that. There are a couple of benefits, of course, of having an API gateway in place, which I'll be going into shortly. But it's sort of the idea here is it sort of enables you to abstract out the business logic versus some of the administrative things that you need to take care of, such as security, such as rate limiting, which we will talk about shortly. So my architecture right now has all of these underlying microservices which are being exposed through APIs. Now, not every microservice needs to be exposed through individual APIs. There could be a combination of these. And it's being fed into my API gateway, which is essentially doing some administrative work. And then it is being called by my front-end applications. I could have a variety of applications here, whether that is a mobile-based application, web-based application, or any other device that I want my users to interact with. And then finally, I've got my user up there. So very, very simple setup. I want to get up. So my consideration here is I want to get up and running really, really quickly. Let's assume I'm going to be looking at, let's say if I'm sitting here in Singapore, I want to get started really, really quickly, really, really easily. I've got this up and running in a very simple format. In terms of considerations, while you're doing it, of course, there would be the consideration of cloud versus on-premise. So think about what you want. If you do believe that you're just looking to get up and running really, really quickly, perhaps a cloud-based solution may be the way to go. However, if you're looking to get a significant amount of control, you want to have your infrastructure under your own control, you might consider on-premise. Or what the second consideration there might be is the local regulations. So maybe if a cloud vendor is not available, which tends to happen in APAC specifically, say for a region like, say, Indonesia, for instance, sometimes it can be quite challenging to have a specific cloud vendor or the desired cloud vendor to essentially provide the services that we would want, and in which case on-premises might be your only option out there. And further to local regulations, if your regulation dictates that your data cannot leave your country, the region you are set up in, even in that case as well, I think sometimes people tend to lean a little bit more on your on-premises versus cloud. But again, if you have a cloud vendor that is focused and targeted towards your own region, then by all means, you can go for that choice as well. My idea here was to get up and running really, really quickly. So I've chosen a cloud hosting provider in Singapore for my single region setup that I have right now as well. One other thing is vendor agnosticism. I'm not sure if the agnosticism is a word per se, but I'm just coining it at this point. But really what I mean by that is, Of course, when you're starting off, sometimes we may or may not have a foresight. It could really be a proof of concept. We're really testing out the market. We don't know if our business is really going to flourish or not. Obviously, we want it to flourish, but we might need to pivot. We might need to change. We might need to think about, what else can we do if things don't go according to plan. Now, there are typically two tropes here. One is you might come across cloud platform vendors, including API management platforms, where you get a one-stop solution that handles everything, where you could have your local hosting, you could have your cloud hosting, you could have your DNSs, you could have your API gateways, all of it sort of managed through one single place. Now, while that could be a really, really great way to get started, it could even be cost effective, but it can be quite difficult sometimes when you're trying to scale it up at a future date. I'm not saying it is impossible, but sometimes what could be a challenge is you might start looking at different cloud providers or different solution providers who need to work cohesively very nicely with your solution across multiple regions. Or you might be looking to expand into a region where that cloud provider just doesn't exist. And then you're stuck a little bit in terms of how do you integrate with all of these all of these different all of these different mini solutions or siloed solutions. How do you bring those things all together? So where vendor agnostic, that's what you call a little bit of vendor lock-in. Again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can have its own challenges. But where a vendor agnostic solution comes in is it sort of gives you a level of flexibility, especially when you are in the early stages of your business, where you might need to pivot, you might need to move into something else. You might have to add on new services, or you might need to look at new different regions that you might be looking to incorporate. Having a layer of flexibility with your solution can go a long way in terms of the success of your business, or even the scaling, especially when you're looking to scale your product across across multiple regions, as well as multiple vendors for that matter, for different needs of yours. So that sort of gives you a little bit of a setup in terms of what we are looking at with our toy store. Diving a little bit into what an API platform, API management platform sort of does in terms of the API lifecycle management. So of course, if you work with APIs, they're essentially means of communication between different services and means of exposing those services to the external world or for consumption by applications. And there are different aspects of this. There are typically two players here, or two roles here, which is obviously an API provider, the one who's providing those APIs, and API consumers, the ones who are actually consuming it, which would be your partners or third-party applications. And they sort of go through this entire journey of managing, securing, testing, creating, designing, discovering, developing, consuming. All of these parts essentially is where an API management platform or an API gateway to a certain extent, but an API management platform at large could essentially help you out with. And this is sort of what I was alluding to when I was talking about, what you could sort of almost delegate the API gateway or API management platform to take care of all of these things for you, while you yourself could be really focusing on the business layer or the business logic that needs to power your microservices, and leave the things like security, leave the things like version controls, or leave the things like rate limiting and quota management of your APIs to this application, this API management layer for you to handle. That's just a little bit of an introduction into what an API management platform could bring to the table here. Then let's say we are 1 year down the line and we have sort of gotten to a point where we are doing really well in our region. We've got some users who are now starting to come in from different regions, and we are thinking about scale. Now, there could be two possible solutions here. One, of course, you need to start off with, and before you think about the solution, you just start with your key considerations. One is, what kind of local rules, again, do you need to comply to? You need to think about which region do you need to expand into locally, and what kind of rules what kind of data jurisdictions that you need to really think about when you're doing that. And accordingly, then you would come to one of potentially two solutions here. If you're moving from one region to another region where really the rules are really, really strict. So if you've got such strict regulations where the data really cannot leave the geographical boundaries of a specific country or specific region. So let's take an example of if EU were to come in with a regulation and say, look, our data is never going to be leaving EU. You can only have it stored, processed, and collected within our region, cannot leave the geographical boundaries of our region at all. So in which case, one possible solution could be a siloed approach here. So you're essentially replicating your application, all three layers of your application essentially, and making it available across those two regions, but they are essentially siloed solutions. And the way you would then pick or make it available to your users could be through geographical DNSs, which would look at which region a user is coming in and would redirect them to your solution of that specific region. So this obviously, a siloed solution obviously has a couple of benefits. One is that you really get a huge amount of control in terms of what kind of rules, what kind of regulations that you need to follow and adhere to them accordingly, without having to have any cross-region intermingling of data, so to speak. And that gives you a whole lot of control. But again, with that control, typically there comes a level of lack of convenience, because now you're getting into a situation where you have to potentially maintain two parallel solutions. Your code base could potentially still stay the same, but you still have to look into your deployment strategies. You need to potentially even have resources available, teams available who would be looking at these solutions separately on their own, essentially. So that's where it comes in, and it could potentially even become a little bit of a hindrance when you're looking at further scalability of your solution. So definitely something to be mindful of. Of course, if there is no way, then there is no way. You might need to do this. There may not be another way around it. But so once again, to emphasize, being aware of the regulations that you need to adhere to, I think becomes quite important. So across those two regions, if I'm scaling my ACME TriStore, this could be one way of doing it. An alternate way of doing this, where I might be looking at maybe giving up a little bit more control, but it could bring in a whole lot of convenience. What you don't see right now here is with that API gateway or API management layer in place, you're still having to manage those completely separately and all of those rules being put together. What could happen as a second solution is you could still have these two separate solutions going, but you could have a hybrid approach where the management of your APIs, the management of the users, and the management of your management at the API management level could be taken care of by this management layer, or as we call it, the control plane. So the way the structure of this would work is you would have these edge gateways operating really close to the geographical regions in which you have your users present. And it's essentially going to be doing all of your data storage, data processing, and collection at that level. But at the same time, it gives you this global management layer, which enables you to sort of manage your different API requirements or different administrative requirements of controlling those edge gateways, of deploying those edge gateways, and understanding what's really going on with each one of them and monitoring all of those at a lot more global level. So of course, the big benefit here is you are capable of computing things locally, storing things locally, but you can then manage your APIs globally in a very convenient manner through a single interface, a single dashboard. So typically, an API management platform consists of an API gateway, a dashboard layer, as well as a developer portal. So the dashboard layer is what you use to essentially manage your APIs and what's really going on, and monitoring and analytics and all of those areas effectively come into play here. So once again, of course, you need to be aware of your regulations here, whether you can do this. Once again, because even if there is a management layer, it does need to sit somewhere. So you need to be aware of what kind of rules need to apply. Here, storage wouldn't be necessarily a problem, but transit could be a potential problem. So data in transit. If you have regulations that say your data cannot transit outside of your geographical location, the solution may not work for you. However, if your regulation states that if you are getting the permission of your users, then there is no problems with it, then the solution could work. If you get your if the regulation essentially tells you that as long as you're not storing any data while it is in transit, then it's okay. Then once again, you can have this. If again the requirement is, if you're dealing with, say, personally identifiable information or PIIs, you need to make sure that your data is essentially anonymized, or it needs to adhere to specific rules of encryption. So all of which, and so this is where I think Tyke comes in. So we are an API management platform, and that whole layer of API gateway, whether individually or the entire API management platform, which then comprises of API gateway, the control plane, which is our dashboard, as well as the developer portal, which essentially makes your APIs available for consumption, is all part of the package that we provide here at Tyke. So you could have all of these. Once again, in terms of setting up, these could be cloud-hosted solutions, or at the same time, these could also be on-premises solutions. And we essentially play well with all of them, and which is what I mean by, if you wanted to host an API gateway in a location where you do not have cloud providers or cloud hosting option available, at least not from one of the bigger players, then you could have your local data center essentially managing all of these things and connecting to our management layer, and still working cohesively with your entire solution, as opposed to having to build these siloed solutions, managing them separately, especially if they are across two different vendors, across two different regions. Adds on to a lot of administrative load in that case. Whereas here, if your API management, the control plane essentially works to have your decoupled solutions, which can independently comply with the requirements and rules of computation, of storage, and transit, but it can help you effectively bring all of that in, bring all of those delegated solutions into one cohesive unit, which becomes quite powerful as an overall solution. It enables growth, it enables scaling, because you can quite easily just add on another region to your management layer and start working through that quite simply. So I hope that sort of gives you a bit of an idea of what we were considering, what we were thinking. I think awareness is quite key here in terms of what kind of rules and regulations you need to think about. Yes, I think as a next slide, I think I go into some of the key takeaways, because I'm just being mindful of time. So I'm going to just talk about what we discussed so far, and of course, I've not dived really deep into, say, the architecture of our solution. The solution over here that I was mentioning is something called the multi-data center bridge, or MDCB offering, that we've got along with a hybrid cloud. And if someone is interested and has specific questions, I will deal with that in the Q&A session, because I do want to give enough time for the Q&A for the audience as well. So just to recap a little bit in terms of what we talked about today, and what, as a final key considerations when you're dealing with data sovereignty, what all do you need to consider? I think the first thing that comes up, if you look at the solution, is that you need to consider your solution as a whole. What I mean by that is when things like compliances or regulations comes in, it's seldom that there is only one component of your solution that needs to be compliant. It's typically your entire stack that needs to be compliant, and therefore you need to think about your solution as a whole. Now, each individual component of your stack could be dealing with data sovereignty requirements, or could be dealing with compliance or regulatory requirements in their own way, and they might be contributing towards the greater goal of being compliant. So an API management gateway, for instance, could be an enabler in a way where it's not going to be storing any information in transit. It will be adding a layer of encryption and adding a layer of security while data is in transit. It can enable the anonymization of data when things are being stored. So all of this essentially could be handled by an API management gateway for you, as an example, as a component. But when you're thinking about compliances, when you're thinking about data sovereignty, you need to consider your entire solution stack as a whole and think about how each individual component contributes towards the larger goal. Second is location. So this obviously is very important when it comes to data sovereignty. Particularly, a lot of it is really trying to comply to your local jurisdiction that your data needs to comply to. A typical tip or recommendation that I do hear a lot when it comes to this is when you're architecting solution across two different regions, typically look at the region which has stricter rules, and probably start with that, because if you're adhering to the strictest of rules, then of course you're likely to be adhering to every other potential rule that is in place as well. So that's a sort of a tip. I mean, of course, it may also have a drawback, because if you're trying to be that strictly compliant across all of the regions, it could have strain on your business. You might need to think about your overall processes. You need to think about your resource requirements. But again, as a tip, if you're really, really worried about compliance, especially in the more regulated industries like healthcare or financial services, you might not have a way around that, and it might be the safer bet, effectively, to deal with your regulations, which is a bit more stricter. And that's where the choice of location could come in as well. So there are definitely locations or countries around the world which are a lot more strict when it comes to their data rules and privacy requirements, as opposed to some of the others. Now, I'm in no way trying to tell you that you should try and sneak your way around that. I think data rules and data privacy policies are very, very important today, because breaches can have huge impact, not just for businesses, but actually for users themselves. So, but again, if there is a specific requirement, if you've got two choices where your users are really coming from, and picking between, say, the more compliance-heavy regions like probably Germany, for instance, versus some places which are a little less strict when it comes to how your data is handled from your data regulation or policy perspective, then you can make that choice, or you at least need to consider that as a choice. It could essentially be beneficial for you. But by all means, privacy first, data security first, before looking at when you're making those decisions. Next is transparency. Transparency becomes very, very important. Transparency in here is really around understanding what kind of services your cloud hosting providers or your data centers are providing you. So what I mean by that is, when you do think about things like recovery, automatic backups or automatic recoveries, or how your data is transiting from one region to the other, it is very, very important to understand exactly how this is working. And that's where you need to consider the transparency that your solution provider or your SaaS product provider or your cloud hosting provider is providing to you. Ideally, think about the fine print, do your due diligence, because once again, these are one of those things, once you go wrong, things could really, really pile up, and it could really have a cascading effect onto your business, not just from the growth perspective, but from the overall business as it exists today. So I think seeking that transparency, again, is not a wrong thing. You should definitely look at doing that, and figure out, do your due diligence before you proceed with selecting the partner of choice. And then finally, the vendor agnosticism. Again, I don't know if this is a word, but really what I'm alluding to is flexibility of solution, especially when you're looking at scalability, especially when you are looking at rules, regulations, compliances. I think being locked into specific solutions where compliances could become a challenge in the future, I think, or you may not really be aware of it, could be a bit of a challenge for your scale. Once again, no right or wrong answer per se. I mean, if the regions are already available with your hosting provider or your solution provider, by all means, it might actually give you a better deal in terms of your overall costs and expenses. But the level of flexibility can go a long way when you're really a smaller business looking to grow, or bigger or medium or bigger size business looking to really expand further out. I think because the future, you can really never truly predict what kind of things might be coming in. So having something a little bit flexible that does not lock you in. So again, I'm alluding a little bit to Tyke, because after all, I am a product evangelist here for Tyke. So I'm doing a little bit of a plug there, where we essentially play very nicely with almost every kind of hosting provider, every kind of data center that you can think of. And we are pretty much almost plug and play in this case, where we would fit into your solution. We're enablers of your solution. We're enablers of your business growth. And you can run us, whether you're running on AWS or Google Cloud or Azure or your own data center or local cloud hosting providers. There is really, really no restrictions when it comes to how we operate and how we can work. So that's that. And there is one final slide, which is essentially a bonus takeaway, because I think I've hinted at this a lot throughout the entire presentation. But this is very, very important because you need to be aware. You need to be aware about the rules. You need to be aware about the regulations that you need to adhere to. These could really, really benefit you because you may or may not need to comply to everything that is out there. You may not need to comply to the strictest of rules that are out there, and therefore spend a lot of time and resources on being compliant to those. Of course, you should look at, once again, I need to emphasize, you should look at data security, you should look at privacy rules on your own, but you may not need to go down the strictest of adherences that come along with some of the different regions or some of the even different verticals. So if you're not, say, in the financial services business, or if you're not in, say, the healthcare business, you might not have to go in all out when it comes to the privacy rules. But at the same time, if you are in some of those businesses that are highly regulated, which have big, higher compliance requirements, then again, being aware is a must once more, because you need to be aware of what kind of rules you need to comply to and be compliant. Otherwise, your solution may be blocked or stopped, or you might need to again get into legal battles, which none of us would want moving forward. So that's it. I think that is my last slide. With that, I will bring my presentation to an end. I think this is time for questions or comments. I'll be happy to take them. I think we are just about 40 minutes in, so it gives us a good chunk of time for conversation then. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see things once more.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you doing? Thank you very much for that presentation. Just a quick one before we get started with the Q&A. A question that people typically ask is, how can I see it again, or portions of the presentation again? The session will be available on demand almost instantly after we've finished. So feel free to go through Buddha's presentation again, rewind, pause, that kind of thing, and see any of the technical bits or the drawings that you want to see. Secondly, is that you might have noticed that the banners and everything for this presentation was blue and was presented as Blueprint. So Blueprint's our sister brand. We've got a virtual event coming up next week, Wednesday, actually. Buddha is presenting there as well, so you can catch up with Buddha again. There's about 70 presentations over 2 days. It should be a really excellent event. So if this is your kind of thing, do register for it. It's one of the links on the attachments, as is some extra type information there as well. So I'm going to kick off with my first question, Buddha. What sort of mistakes do people make typically when they start doing this? How do they get themselves into hot water?
I think that's a good one. I think that's what I was trying to illustrate there as well, where I was talking about two key things that you need to really consider. One is looking at your data at rest, but also your data in transit. I think a lot of people can go wrong with that, where they really think about data storage and how data is being collected, but not how data is transiting across different regions. And especially when you're looking at, say, a cloud-hosted environment, then some of these things may not be as transparent as, say, an on-premises setup. So I think that's something that people can go wrong with. But once again, it really comes down to being aware of the rules and regulations that really you need to adhere to. Just because you're in a specific region doesn't automatically mean you need to comply to the highest of standards sometimes, or your industry plays a big role there. So I think there are a couple of different aspects there where you really need to think about how your data is at rest and in transit. The other part would be, even at data at rest, I think the typical thing is inside a lot of cloud hosting platforms I've seen, you can just have these little checkboxes saying automatic recovery and automatic backups. So I think that's where, again, could be a bit of a challenge, because you might not know where exactly that backup is happening. So if it is if it's being backed up to the United States and your primary users are in, say, the EU region, then your compliance rules are no longer the same anymore. So you need to think about that before making that choice. So yeah, so I think these are typically places where people would go a little bit off.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. And then we talked about local compliance rules. You mentioned a couple of examples. I wondered if you could give an example of something that would be tricky. You said, obviously Germany's got strict rules, but the combination of two, maybe if you started in the UK or if you started in the US, where would it be? Where would you need to concentrate and maybe get outside help if you were trying to deal with?
I think places I think EU probably has some of the strictest of rules at this point of time, especially when it comes to data. I think we're all aware of GDPR, or the General Data Protection Rules. I think that's probably one of the stricter ones that exist at this point of time around the world. We have a version of that here in Singapore as well. I think it's called PDPA, which is the Personal Data Protection Act, I think. It is not as strict as GDPR, I think, but it again looks into personally identifiable information and how you're dealing with that. So with some of these rules in place, I think that the way you need to look at it is, again, depending on your industry, what becomes important is if you are really looking at compliances, and that's a key consideration for your industry, I think start with the place which is probably higher on compliances. So the stricter rules might be the place to get started on, because then when you're looking to expand out, you might already be compliant to all of those rules anyway. But of course, storage and how things are being stored when you're moving across regions, of course, you need to think about that, of course. But if your solution is built for compliance and it's built in a way where it is flexible to adhere to all of these, I think becomes a lot easier. There could be another camp there who says, okay, let's start small and start at a place which is a little bit simpler to get started on, and then we'll move into the more compliant aspect as well. Again, nothing wrong with that, but do remember that once you do expand into that, once again, the stricter rules will probably take precedence over the less strict rules. So ultimately, you need to think about the stricter rules first before anything else.
Perfect. There's a good question just come in actually about sort of internal responsibility for this kind of thing. Is asking, who should take responsibility? Is it the developers themselves? Should there be some sort of governance program? Does it go right up to the CEO? What typically, who's heads on the block here, and who should be making moves to make sure that it's done correctly?
I think as a product business for us, it's a bit to do with philosophy as well. I think for us, building a solution that enables people to bring the best for their business has been very important, and compliance is always a key aspect of that, especially in the regions that we operate. Right now, we operate quite globally. So it does, I would say, comes from the top, yes, but I think it may be wrong to say that there's a single person who's really just responsible for this. It's a bit of a philosophy around the business as well, where we're really looking to do our best when it comes to data privacy. We want to make sure that the users of our platform, because we are sort of a B2B2C sort of business where our users are actually businesses, and those businesses have their own users. So for us to enable such businesses is a philosophy that has always been top of our priority. I think when we talk about teams within other businesses, I'm not sure if it's a single person, but if I had to pinpoint one, it could be the product owner, depending on how you're structured. I think a product owner, as a person who is setting the vision, setting how your product is going to move forward, could be that person. But at the same time, you need to empower your developers, or they need to be aware why this is something that is quite important and crucial, because they are ultimately the ones building those solutions. You don't want to get into a situation where you're constantly testing a solution, that is this okay, this is okay. I mean, you should be looking at that for sure. But once you have that philosophy down, coming right from the top across the organization, everyone is aware why this is important, I think it becomes a lot less of a challenge or a lot less of a silo, which is where you don't want to be.
Yeah, fine. And we go back to something you were mentioning at the start of the presentation around sort of control and convenience and the offset. So taking, say, tight customers, for example, people who you've got some experience dealing with, what's more important to them? What's their driver? Are they looking for control, or are they looking for convenience typically?
I think there's a similar answer to this again, because I think it really has been dependent on the region as well as the industry in which people have been. So when we start dealing with, say, the more government services side of things, the need for control is definitely a lot higher. We've also seen some solutions, especially around the APAC region sometimes, have had pretty strict rules. But at the same time, they've also had a bit of a challenge where the availability of cloud-hosted solutions or SaaS solutions have not been as strong as, say, some of the regions, say, in the United States or the European Union, for instance, or the European continent at large. So I think it's a few different considerations to be done. I feel like it's a bit of a split at this point, depending on what kind of industry you're based in. But once again, for us, what we have tried to do is we have tried to make solutions available in a way where if people, whether they are on the spectrum of control or whether they're on the spectrum of convenience or a mix of both, we've sort of tried to make all of that available. So we have a SaaS platform, which is plug it, this is start off, sign up and start playing with it. But we also have a fully on-premise solution, which is completely on its own, and you can have your regulations in there. So once again, I'll bring up, say, Indonesian clients, for instance. They have very, very strict data rules, especially in the government services. So there, the on-premises goes a little bit more versus the others. Whereas some of the other open solutions, where we've seen even in places like for e-commerce, for instance, sometimes we've seen solutions which are hosted on the cloud at this point of time. And then there we have the good middle layer where we have that hybrid solution where the control plane, the management is happening on a SaaS platform, and you can plug in your local gateways, so to speak, or your local solutions into that so that they work cohesively. So we've got the full range that we have made available, but I think that's where the control versus convenience part is really dependent on the kind of industry you're in, kind of location you're in, and the kind of users that you are looking to service.
Perfect. I'm going to ask you a question to wrap things up about the kind of culture element you were talking about, the teamwork element and thing. In terms of anyone who, would you like to answer the question that's just come in about Tyke actually before we go? Is Tyke open source?
Yes. So I think I mentioned about 3 different components here. One was the gateway, which is essentially the center of power for our entire platform. So we've got a dashboard, we've got a gateway, and we've got a developer portal. So the gateway is essentially what powers our entire solution, and that gateway itself is actually open source. So you can see the entire code, you can extend it. It is a very, very flexible solution, a very, very lightweight, low latency solution that we have. It is, and that's how we got started. I think our founder wanted to have a solution which would manage all his APIs really, really easily without having to pay too much money. He created this open source solution over a weekend, which then saw a lot of traction. And then the commercial side started coming in where people wanted a couple more additions to it, which is where the dashboard came in as essentially a management layer where you can see and interact with your APIs, you can analyze it, you can have user groups and user controls, all of those things in place, adding your security layers and all of that. But all of that, again, is being powered by that open source gateway that we have. And the developer portal, again, fits into this, which exposes all of these APIs that are being controlled or powered by that gateway for consumption externally. So yes, so Tyke is an open source product. Our gateway is open source, and it is always going to be open source as well.
Perfect. I thought that was important to cover just before we got onto my last question, which is about the you said about getting everybody on board for this kind of thing. If someone's starting a journey with this, what's the good advice for them? What's the good advice to get people onto team data sovereignty, whereas perhaps that wasn't an issue they were considering before while doing their job? So what advice would you give to people starting out?
I think it might depend on where you're. So if you're saying that the company is sort of just starting off in their journey, then I think a good way to start is there needs to be someone who sort of understands the nuances of data sovereignty. I think so. Research definitely is a very, very big aspect of it. Then ideally, you might want to have a champion internally. So a person who sort of gets or kicks things off in a way where people understand the reason or why this is such an important thing. I would be very surprised if someone today doesn't understand why data sovereignty is important, I think. But in the context of their own business, I think having that bit of an internal champion becomes quite valuable, because that person could be the go-to person when you're getting started. You may have a lot of questions. You may be stumbling upon a few things. So having that little champion internally becomes quite effective in growth. And you learn as you go. You see how the context works for you. So I think that could be a good way to start. Be aware of what requirements are in the context of a business, what requirements you need to adhere to, and then start talking about it internally and get more people on board with that.
Perfect. Well, with that, I'll draw us to the close. Very enjoyable session. Thanks very much, Buddha. It's been a pleasure to meet you. We'll see you again on Wednesday at Blueprint. And from Big Data London /Blueprint, it's goodbye. Goodbye, Buddha, and goodbye, everybody at home. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, and see you next time.
Yeah, see you next time. Cheers, Buddha. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.